Hi, this is Paul. In this video, I'm going to ponder some of the strangeness of this moment. In my last video, I talked about the moderate pause, which I think is why we're seeing this, at least for many people, unexpected change in direction in the trajectory of the Christian Reformed Church. I'm going to try to integrate into this a lot of the things that I've been doing in my videos for the last 5 years. Now, a lot of people in the Christian Reformed Church have found my channel because of the videos that I've been making about the Christian Reformed Church Synod. But I've been developing ideas over the last 5 years in conversation with a broad variety of conversation partners that actually get into my thoughts on what's happening right now. So let's get into it. And so, at least initially, I'm thinking about this as confessionality, religion, and attention. And we'll see what the video actually is entitled by the end of the video. This is actually a very strange moment if you sort of take a step back and look at the church and think about it. We're having a denominational existential struggle fighting over the interpretation of a Heidelberg Catechism lesson, thou shalt not commit adultery. Isn't adultery seemingly the most obvious and agreed upon commandment that we have? With all of the changes in sexual morality and sexual standards since the sexual revolution and the wave of the counterculture, adultery seems to be the one thing that doesn't go away. Everybody agrees that cheating is bad. Now, it seems that in this sort of libertarian moment, as long as you declare what you're doing, then somehow that can be a valid expression of expressive individualism. But stepping out and not divulging or admitting what you're doing sexually seems to be the greatest sin. Divorce and remarriage has long been a debate in the church. It was a heavy debate in the Christian Reformed Church for many years. It goes all the way back to this debate that they try to bring Jesus into in the Gospel of Matthew. Gene Robinson got famous because he was the first openly gay priest and then eventually bishop in the Episcopal Church in North America. And even Gene Robinson, before he was made a bishop, had to deal with accusations of sexual harassment, which in the end were decided to be unfounded, or at least decided to be unfounded. But even he had to deal with those kinds of accusations. In other words, adultery, regardless of who you're married to or what gender you're married to, seems to be a big deal among many people. Catechism on the Heidelberg Catechism on murder and theft are also very broad. Of course, murder, you're not supposed to malign. Maybe I should just read them because, of course, most of you have no idea what the Heidelberg Catechism says about these things. So you can find the Heidelberg Catechism on the Christian Reformed Church website. The Heidelberg Catechism 1563, that's a fairly early Reformational document, was composed in the city of Heidelberg, Germany, quite near where I'll be doing the German festival this coming fall. At the request of Elector Frederick III, who ruled the province of the Palatinate in 1559 to 1576. The new catechism was intended as a tool for teaching young people, a guide for preaching in the provincial churches, and a form of confessional unity among several Protestant factions in the Palatinate. The old tradition credits Zacharias Ursinus and Caspar Olivianus with being the co-authors of the Catechism, but the project was actually the work of a team of ministers and university theologians under the watchful eye of Frederick himself. Ursinus probably served as the primary writer of the team. Olivianus had a lesser role. The Catechism was approved by the Synod of Heidelberg in January 1563. A second and third German edition, each with small additions, as well as Latin translation, was published that same year in Heidelberg. The third edition was included in the Palatinate Church Order of November 15, 1563, at which time the Catechism was divided into 52 sections or Lord's Days, so that one Lord's Day could be examined in an afternoon worship service each Sunday of the year. And that obviously continued into the 20th century and in even the 21st, perhaps, in some Christian Reformed churches. The Synod of Dort approved the Heidelberg Catechism in 1619 and soon became the most ecumenical of the Reformed catechisms and confessions. It was widely translated in many European, Asian, and African languages and is still the most widely used and warmly praised catechism of the Reformation period. Now, here's a little, those of you who watch some of my rough drafts for Sunday will notice misery, deliverance, gratitude, misery, deliverance, gratitude. I get that right from the Heidelberg Catechism. It's a fairly standard catechism, and it's sort of chopped up into the main things that catechisms of its day would treat, including the Ten Commandments. And so you can zip down to the Ten Commandments, and then you have a treatment of each commandment. And when you get down to something like, what is God's will for the sixth commandment? That you shall not murder. I am not to belittle, hate, insult, or kill my neighbor, not by my thoughts, my words, my looks, or gesture, and certainly not by actual deeds. I am not to be a party of this and other. Rather, I am to put away all desire for revenge. I am not to harm or recklessly endanger myself either. Prevention of murder is why government is armed with the sword. So, it's a very nice answer. And if you, is it enough then that we do not murder our neighbor in such a way? No, by condemning envy, hatred, and anger, God wants us to love our neighbors as ourselves, to be patient, peace-loving, gentle, merciful, and friendly towards them, to protect them from harm as much as we can, and to do good even to our enemies. Then you get unchastity, which is the 108. And then if you jump down to the 8th commandment, God forbids not only outright theft and robbery, punishable by law, but in God's sight, theft also includes scheming and swindling in order to get our neighbor's goods for ourselves, whether by force or means that appear legitimate, such as inaccurate measurements of weight, size, volume, fraudulent merchandising, counterfeit money, excessive interest, or any other means forbidden by God. In addition, God forbids all greed and pointless squandering of his gifts. Pretty broad indeed, and that tends to be what the Catechism does with these commandments. Now, one of the things that I noted back in the 1980s when I was at Calvin Seminary, reading the church order for the first time, what struck me, I still remember this impression I had, was the document. The document was enormously, the document was remarkably focused on maintaining confessional fidelity from generation to generation. You can't read the church order cover to cover and not see that this thing is laser focused on maintaining confessional identity. Now, the church order, there's sort of a hierarchy of authority in the Christian Reformed Church. The highest authority is obviously the Bible. Well, God. Beneath God, his revelation, his special revelation in the Bible, and then the creeds, and then the confessions, because the creeds and confessions really, I was reminded that this has been part of this conversation. Clay Leibold, who's been blogging about these issues for the most part from a progressive posture, talked about creedal in one of his blog posts, and one of my friends said, is he serious? Does he mean creedal or confessional? Because creedal tends to be shared by a much broader church group. Confessional tends to be much more particular, little ways down the tree with respect to Protestants. But the confessions are documents born out of historical context, and their attention bears the selection of concerns for these contexts. For example, the Canons of Dort very much wrestled with the Arminian controversy in the 17th century. The Belgic Confession and the Canons of Dort are far older. So if you go to the denominational webpage, you can see the three confessions, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and the Canons of Dort. Heidelberg Catechism written in 1563, 2 years after the Belgic Confession. The Belgic Confession sort of walks through classic Christianity, but again with respect to the concerns of its day. The oldest of the doctrinal standards of the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church in America is the Confession of Faith, popularly known as the Belgic Confession, following the 17th century Latin designation Confessio Belgica. Belgica refers to the whole of the Netherlands, both north and south, which today is divided into Netherlands and Belgium. They did a really nice job on these little introductions on the CRC website. The CRC has a lot of very competent people. The confession's chief author was Guido de Brès, a preacher of the Reformed Church of the Netherlands who died a martyr of the faith in the year 1567. During the 16th century, the churches in this country were exposed to the terrible persecution by Roman Catholic government. To protest against this cruel oppression, now, again, you notice that, well, the emphasis is on the religion, and certainly this very much was part of religion, but yeah, there were a lot of other political things going on at the same time. These things are very much wed together. To protest against this cruel oppression and to prove to the persecutors that the adherents of the Reformed faith were not rebels, as laid to their charge, but law-abiding citizens who profess the true Christian doctrine according to the Holy Scriptures, de Brès prepared this confession in the year 1561. In the following year, a copy was sent to King Philip II, together with an address which the petitioners declared that they were ready to obey the government in all lawful things, but that they would offer their backs to stripes and their tongues to knives and their mouths to gags and their bodies to the fire, rather than deny the truth expressed in this confession. Notice the fervency of confessional fidelity here in this prologue. This was the most important thing they could do, worthy of their lives. Some of you might also know that John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, which was the most famous book, the most popular book that he wrote, is a preface to King Francis I of France. In the most mighty and illustrious monarch, Francis, most Christian king of France, wow, it's very fine things to say about a Roman Catholic monarch, his sovereign John Calvin craves peace and salvation in Christ. Point 1, circumstances in which the book was first written. When I first set my hand to this work, nothing was farther from my mind, most glorious king, than to write something that might afterwards be offered to your majesty. My purpose was solely to transmit certain rudiments by which those who are touched with any zeal for religious might be shaped to true godliness. I undertook this labor especially for our French countrymen, many of whom I knew to be hungering and thirsting for Christ, but I saw very few who had been duly imbued with even a slight knowledge of him. The book itself witnesses that this was my intention, adapted as it is to a simple and, you may say, elementary form of teaching. And Calvin's Institutes will grow and grow and grow and grow and become one of the most popular books, reformational books in that time period. And through this book, Reformed Christianity will grow and grow and grow and become one of the popular main expressions of reformational Christianity. Now, what this dynamic sets up are tensions between fixed documents and ongoing contextual concerns. In other words, there are always different concerns that arise, and we've seen a remarkable pace of change in the modern period. One of the more important incidences of this was the conversation surrounding Harry Bohr, a lot of which he wrote in this book. And apparently, ever since I started talking about this, a number of seminarians over the years have written papers on this, and it makes a lot of sense. You can still find Bohr's book out in the used book market, so I picked one up. And it's an important read, whether or not you're interested in the doctrine of reprobation and the canons of Dort. It's a very interesting read with respect to assumptions about how a community lives with 500-year-old documents. Now, even saying that, for a number of people, they'll sort of jump in and say, yeah, it needs to be updated. Okay, well, what to update and what to not update is never an easy thing, because, as I mentioned, everybody's still sort of down against adultery. But when it comes to all sorts of other things, oh yeah, we can update that. And the truth is, some things we tend to look back towards and say, no, we need to bring that back. And other things we tend to look and say, no, this needs to be updated. The document remarkably focuses on maintaining confessional fidelity from generation to generation. That, of course, is the church order. But Harry Boer, and he was a missionary professor of theology in Nigeria, and he, following the love of God controversy with Harold Decker, if I recall correctly, there was just a lot of question about, well, does God love everyone, or does God just love? And what do we mean by love? And it's actually a fairly nuanced and complex theological conversation. And Harry Boer had some issues with it, and he looked at the Christian Reformed system, and, well, he wanted to file a confessional revision gravamen, and so he did so. And, what he begins to discover is that nobody's really quite sure what to do with all of this, because on one hand, they apparently all loved and trusted Harry Boer. Again, he was part of this post-World War II generation, and he wanted to be honest, and he wanted to see the Christian Reformed Church update, but he began to realize that nothing sort of worked the way he thought it should work. And in the end, he served his entire career as a missionary, professor of theology, as a minister of the word in good standing, even though there's a little bit of drama, again, over his views about reprobation. There was eventually a synodical committee that argued against his view, but basically, in a sense, said, but, Harry, we trust you. You're one of us. We're not going to kick you out of the church or put you under discipline or anything like that. But with respect to this issue, you're wrong, and here are the reasons why. And the vast, vast majority of Christian Reformed Church members will probably not read with the kind of depth, insight, or questions of Harry Boer. I'm not saying he's right, but one of the things that sort of disturbed Harry Boer was he's waging this battle seemingly about some really foundational confessional issues in the Christian Reformed Church, and nobody seemed to care. And Synod was too busy with all of the other things that were going on in Synod. At that point, the women in church office fights were just beginning to sort of pick up steam. And not a lot of people had a lot of interest or concern with what this retiring missionary of theology in Nigeria thought about this and that. It all just seemed rather disconnected from everything. Now, of course, when it comes to an issue like the current one, well, that's a lot different, because sexuality is something that impacts most of our lives. Now, someone coming to this channel from the Christian Reformed Church might wonder, well, the only thing they know about Paul Vanderklay is he made some videos about Synod, and maybe the word Vanderklay they recognize because of Stan Vanderklay or Hiram Vanderklay, my father and my grandfather. But why on earth is he on YouTube? Well, and what has he been doing on YouTube? Well, over the last 5 years, I've been having conversations that go mostly completely disconnected, at least on the surface, with the Christian Reformed Church. Others from the outside the CRC might wonder what I was doing before I was talking about Jordan Peterson, because that sort of brought me to the attentional economy of YouTube. So two of my ongoing conversation partners have been Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke. You hear me mentioning them a fair amount. And you see in these two videos, and if you watch the conference that we just had in Chino, we're doing a lot of conversation about collective bodies, attention, and concern. To what degree, what we're really talking is about the nature and reality of spirit. Now, a lot of this sort of got kicked off in YouTube land by the rise of Jordan Peterson, who first sort of made news by talking about compelled speech in Canada with respect to pronouns. And Jordan Peterson is the kind of temperament that, and if you really push him on something, if he's really convicted by it, he's sort of like Martin Luther in that he's going to dig in and he's not going to be moved. And he's got a quick mind and a sharp tongue, and he's not afraid to use it. And this is a lot of what sort of picked up all the attention in 2016 about the Bill C-16 in Canada. And of course, I didn't hear much of anything about that, but late in 2016, early in 2017, I began bumping into him with things. And he really caught my attention when I noted he was doing a biblical series. And I thought, well, that was interesting. But what caught my attention about it was I noticed that people were writing things in online forums like Reddits and in comment forums and on Twitter. And I had noticed that for a long time throughout my ministry, people had been leaving the church, basically going towards agnosticism or atheism or pursuing more New Age things, meditation, yoga, Eastern religions, this kind of thing. And for the most part, that looked like a one-way street. But I noticed that people paying attention to Jordan Peterson seemed to be coming back down that street towards the church again. And I began to wonder, what is this about? So then I start listening to his biblical series, and first I thought, well, maybe he's some evangelical that sort of kept making his way through University of Toronto. But once you listen to his biblical series, you realize, no, he's no evangelical at all. And I didn't know hardly anything about Carl Jung or any of this. But where I found him really helpful was where I had found C.S. Lewis helpful in terms of sort of trying to combine two worlds. Because every Sunday, on one hand, I recognized that people were coming to my church wanting to hear stories about the Bible and how the Bible connected to their real life. And the more you study the Bible, the more you begin to realize that the culture and concerns of biblical authors are in many ways quite divorced from the culture and concerns of the people in the pews. And it's the job of preachers, of course, to try to bridge these two worlds. And, well, what I found was that Jordan Peterson was bridging these two worlds not for Christians who had an ostensible and traditional connection to the Bible, but to new atheists and new agers. And I wondered, how is he doing this? Because I certainly haven't shown much aptitude for it. And the church was, in fact, losing ground because of these kinds of issues. You know, this whole series is sort of about why moderates pause. And I look at myself as a moderate who has paused. And I'm probably a progressive, more like Jordan Peterson or Brett Weinstein, a progressive who sort of turned back. And in many ways, a lot of what I saw was that, well, the schemes that I had sort of assumed weren't really holding up. And they weren't getting the kinds of payoffs and payouts that we would imagine they would. So that, you know, I didn't have a lot of conversation partners, Christian Reformed ministers who wanted to talk about Jordan Peterson at that point. And so I decided to make a video, and then I found hundreds and thousands of conversation partners, not exactly what I was expecting. There have been many times that I've thought about just turning off the channel because what am I doing with these kinds of things? Well, with a lot of the digging, of course, meeting John Vervaeke and looking at his awakening from the meaning crisis and watching a lot of these conversations, a lot of this question about what do we mean by spirit seems to run through Renee Descartes, who was one of the foundational philosophers of modernity, one might say, even though, of course, he was a Christian. And in some ways, now, I'm not looking to get into a big discussion about Renee Descartes here, but one of the things downstream from him, whether or not you can say that he taught this or not, was that in some ways, in the early modern period, he tried to sort of bring things together by saying, well, really in the universe, there are sort of two substances. There's sort of material substance and spiritual substance. And you know, in some videos I talk about the upper and lower register, and this mapping is pretty durable and works in a number of different ways. But what that sort of meant was a divide in the world, and Christians were groups of people who accepted via tradition and via formation and via a whole bunch of things, sort of the ontology of angels and demons and God and Satan and all these things that would be designated spiritual. Sometimes much later in the modern period, people would come up with the word supernatural, which I think actually isn't a great word. I think the word supernatural actually concedes too much to the systems that the framing is dependent upon. But basically what happens post-Enlightenment within modernity is that classical ontology is the study of being, classical ontology is reversed. Classically, everyone in the world assumed that spirit was primary and material was derivative. And as modernity and the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution continued to pick up steam, this was all sort of reversed. John Vervaeke nicely framed it once as sort of Neoplatonism inverted or turned on its head, where matter and material is primary, and well, it's because we've evolved to such great lengths that we have all this mental machinery where we have imagination and we can think about, we just dream strange dreams and tell stories that, God and angels and demons and all these supernatural things, all these spiritual things just go away. And one easy way to think about this is, well, what if all human beings, and let's say all sentient creatures in the universe that have arrived at the level that we have with our capacity for abstraction, what if we were all to go away? Would God, angels, and demons and everything like that go with us too? In other words, God didn't make us, we made God. And there's a lot more that you can say about this, but I'm just trying to have it short. And part of this was, of course, the reason why this sort of vast walking away from church happened, especially with New Atheism, that, well, God and angels and demons and principalities and powers, they're all just, either ways of talking or functions of your imagination or something like that. And what we know is that science, or at least manipulating material reality and chemical reality and physical reality, all of our mind is downstream from that. Therefore, that's where the real action is. So psychology and sociology are then downstream from biology and physics. And the church's language about God, angels, demons, and souls is all anachronistic. Now, C.S. Lewis once quipped that atheists can't be too careful about their reading if they want to maintain their atheism. And it seems that the same is true with respect to science. That cognitive science, John Vervaeke, of course, is founded the cognitive science department at University of Toronto. Over the last few decades, philosophers have and physicists have sort of become a little unnerved by this reductive materialist system. If you want to watch one of my videos where I sort of made this clear, is a video I entitled "The Hiding Spirits That Rule the World." Because very quickly, a lot of questions emerge from this reductive materialist universe. What exactly is governing the continual evolution of our contexts? The Apostle Paul and others in his day saw the flow of history as a consequence of spiritual forces at work through the visible material creation, including people and governments and all of those sorts of things. Charismatics today might talk about spiritual warfare, but then sort of Renee Descartes kind of creeps in again, because you can have, a book like This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti, and it's sort of a kludge the way people are sort of putting together spiritual warfare. And, one of the ongoing conversations about this synod was, boy, there's just so much prayer and so much devotions and so much singing. And if you sit back and ask, why all the prayer, devotions, and singing, how is that connected to the decisions we make? I mean, if we pray for 3 hours and make a decision in 2 hours because we prayed for 3 hours, does that mean it's a better decision? What exactly are we thinking about things, and how are these worlds supposed to be put together? And, these are the kinds of issues that people won't talk about because, what minister is going to be against devotions or singing or prayer or worship? Why are we going to be against these? But you talk to ministers in the denomination, they've got thoughts about it, but they'll kind of keep to themselves because, you don't want to raise issues about some things. And as the conversation has developed over the last 5 years, one of the things that we've noticed is that attention itself is a very big deal when it comes to how human beings live. You know, the persecution that killed Guido de Bray, well, that was a mixture of all sorts of layers of attention and importance and politics and religion. And the way that John Calvin spoke to Francis I of France was a mixture of all sorts of layers and situations. And you find just that there are waves of things that go through history. And the more capable we are with respect to writing things down, and the more educated we are with respect to history and all sorts of things, just helps us to know that, wow, contexts are incredibly important. Some of the things that people were concerned about 50 years ago, we're not concerned much at all about. My grandmother had this wonderful story about when she was a little girl going to Oakdale Park Christian Reformed Church. One of the new technologies of my grandmother's day when she was a little girl was flesh-colored stockings. And so one Sunday she went to church with flesh-colored stockings. And even though my grandmother was decidedly against women as ministers, my grandmother, my father's mother, was by no means a wilting wallflower. She was sharp and quick-tongued and was very eager and ready to tell people exactly what she thought. In fact, she wrote a good number of articles for the Banner in her years. And so she goes to church probably as a 7 or 8 or a 9-year-old girl. And there she is in church, and she's wearing her flesh-colored stockings. And one of the old men of the church confronts her and basically says, little girls ought not to go to church with bare legs. And she just tooted right back at him and said, I'm wearing flesh-colored stockings. Put him in his place. Flesh-colored stockings, I mean, these things seem so anachronistic, but then we have this larger narrative where we say, yes, the real movement of history is about liberation, where little girls were, back in the bad old days, little girls were oppressed in the colors of stockings that were available to them. And isn't it wonderful that we now live in this new age of freedom? But if you've looked at a lot of my other videos, you've noticed that, well, freedom is a very funny thing. Because often, it depends what we're looking at. And we can say, look at flesh-colored stockings and women in office and a number of these things and say, yes, freedom is on the march. But there are whole ranges of things that we can't do today that could be done then. And most people would look at that list and say, yeah, that list is good. But isn't that list also anti-free? In other words, your perspective on things and the things you're looking at and the ways you're looking at things has a great deal to do with your evaluation and your assessment of things. We spend our time, where we spend our time, what we focus on, what we invest our energy in, and what we spend our money on has a great deal to do with attention. And if there's anything that the technological innovations over the last 150 years have done is, well, given us more things to spend our attention on. Books, of course, were fairly early. And then newspapers and magazines and radio and television. And if there's anything that's an attention economy, it is, of course, the internet. Worship itself is mostly made up of traditional, intentional, communal attention. And in that way, it's sort of like a movie, because a movie is not just, you can watch some filmmakers playing around with these ideas. The movie is not just sort of a film camera watching things. Movies are about attention. You might notice right now that because of the camera that I'm using and the lens that I'm using, my face is in focus, and there's a little rectangle around my face on the camera screen to let me know that wherever I go, it's watching my face. But now if I cover my face, it's going to focus on something else. So let's say if I want to do this, it'll very quickly learn, he's not looking at his face. There's my face. Now it's gone. This is not an advertisement for Sony cameras, although Sony cameras focus well. It's a fact that by virtue of even how my camera is working, I am directing your attention. I am choosing words and topics to direct your attention. If you look at film, for example, film is all about directing attention. And it's all about the way we direct attention, and it's all about influencing people by the direction of attention. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Hear, attention, attention. The Lord is in his holy temple, and all the earth keeps silent. For years in the Christian Reformed Church, these were the first words out of the minister's mouth. The Lord is in his holy temple, and all the earth keeps silent before him. Pass out those peppermints to the children there. See, if I want it in focus, got to put it by my face. If I put it up here, got to cover my face. There they are. A tin given to me by a certain Jewish friend of mine. This crazy world. So worship is actually all about attention. And because in many ways, that which you give your attention to is that which will control your life. And you can see this even in non-worship spaces. John Vervaeke was one of the early pioneers studying mindfulness, and John Vervaeke actually has a lot of very interesting things to say about the current mindfulness revolution. In some ways, the current mindfulness revolution is not doing what people say it should do. But most of the Eastern religions that you find and are popular are because they're mostly about attention and not about the dogmas. Well, what do I mean by the dogmas? All these old stories from these old days that imagined God and angels and demons and souls and stories and all of these things. That's all to the past. I want a religion that is stripped free of these things. And many of the religions that sort of pop up that are in some ways secular religions, they're all about attention. And then certain ideals sort of creep up into the religious structure and their attention. Now, May 15, I've mentioned this. Cover of the banner. I mean, the next banner will probably be the Synod issue. It takes them a little while you have to write all the stories and you have to get them all in the banner, and then the banner has to be mailed to you. So the speed of magazines, I get my Synod banner fairly long after I've watched Synod on YouTube. The church feels itself wagged by its cultural tail. Again, I recommend James Scott's piece that he wrote in 2008, I believe it was, covering the 150th anniversary of the Christian Reformed Church. One point that he made in that article was the Christian Reformed Church no longer controls its own narrative. The Christian Reformed Church, for many years, sort of people lived within that attentional framework. And that's part of the reason why after the Second World War, many of those people who'd be the future leaders of the Christian Reformed Church, well, war has a way of getting your attention if you're a soldier. War has a way of getting your attention if you're the father and mother of a soldier, or the sibling of a soldier, or the spouse of a soldier. War is a giant attention machine. And the Second World War sort of pulled the Christian Reformed Church out of its attention machinery that kept all of its people with focuses on, well, creeds and confessions and reformed mindedness and so on and so forth, especially if you're a farmer. Most of what you're doing is farming, but then in church sort of has exclusive access to a certain part of your mind. Other forces, including technological change, have dictated our attention and the shape of our concerns. The Christian Reformed Church, in the minds of many, is no longer the center of their lives. This sort of passed slowly with people that, well, remember back in the day that if somebody from the Christian Reformed Church would marry someone from the Reformed Church of America, it was a bit of a mixed marriage. Go ahead and look at my conversation I had with Kevin Adams not too long ago. Well, that's no longer the case. Now people, I remember when I better be careful about some of those specific comments. Now people, when they leave the Christian Reformed Church, they can just as easily be Episcopalian or non-denominational, or in many cases, no specific religion at all. The Christian Reformed Church has made plenty of contribution to the nuns. Part of what's happened over the last 100 or so years is that secular concerns increasingly seem increasingly to inhabit religious registers. There's a fine article in Pathos over a year ago now, probably. Great title: How the Civil Rights Movement Converted Liberal White Protestants to Secularism. It's interesting. There's an article in Reform Journal. Reform Journal had a piece: How the Church Growth Movement Has De-Churched Christians. A lot of things have been de-churching Christians for a while. Well, the Civil Rights Movement was, as I said in my previous video, a movement which was really another great awakening in America, but it wasn't a movement that really awakened people into church like the first two. It seems to have awakened a lot of people out of church. Part of what happened during the Civil Rights Movement is that many white churches found themselves no longer the vanguard or cutting edge of moral cultural evolution, and so they had to get up to speed. African American churches in the South, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, was sort of the vanguard, and everybody else was playing catch up. And of course, part of this was applied to church. In the Christian Reformed Church, there were a number of racial reconciliation churches. The church I grew up in was one. Madison Square Church in Grand Rapids was another. And the Sacramento Christian Reformed Church was another. In fact, the only churches that I've been members of in the Christian Reformed Church my whole life have all been these racial reconciliation movement churches. But the Civil Rights Movement very much changed the religious landscape in America. And that, of course, wasn't unique. I very much recommend Mark Knoll's book, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, because, well, a lot of these changes had been simmering below. And of course, in the abolitionist movement, Christians very much were on the vanguard of this, as they were in the Civil Rights Movement, with Dr. King and African American leaders, but white leaders were not. Now, part of what happened in this was the dethroning of the WASPy Christian nationalist imperialist elites, or the Christian globalists. Just look at the United Nations and Eleanor Roosevelt. In some ways, this was sort of peak American mainline Christianity in the middle of the century. I did a video touching on this. Establishment Protestantism won the culture and lost its Christian identity. Very quickly, people decided that, well, you don't really need God. You just need activism to move hearts and minds. And here again, if it's an attentional economy, one of the most powerful attention-directing resources we have is theater and cinema. The camera directs attention. Again, remember focus? Just look at how we talk about focus. The camera directs attention. It incorporates storytelling. It has music. It has all of the elements. And so in many ways, the theater in America became, well, in some ways, the chief pulpit of the culture. Chief storytellers and poets of the culture basically continued to popularize their thinking through these medium. And this is the most powerful influence machinery that the world has ever known, that human beings have ever devised. You can add radio and television and what people are dealing with. People are most directly formed and catechized through the internet, through movies, through books, through the secular culture. Now, much of the culture is the inheritance of the mainline WASPy church, and it has, in fact, continued to evolve. But stability means fear of the future replaces fear of death as the main motivator. Part of what also happens at this point is, whereas if people are reliably dying young, reliably dying all around you, anxiety about what happens after death, well, it sort of has more capital and more status in the culture. As your culture becomes more and more secure, more and more wealthy, and life expectancy broadly speaking, gets further and further, death anxiety sort of gives way to anxiety about the future. One of the things that I've noticed about people is that anxious people tend to be anxious. Angry people tend to be angry. And once you relieve someone's anxiety with respect to one thing, they will quickly find something else to be anxious about. Once you relieve somebody's anger about one thing, they'll quickly find something else to be angry about. Now, in their experience, they feel like I'm anxious because of this. Temperamentally, psychologically, one might say, well, you just tend to be anxious and you're always finding something to be anxious about. Similarly, you find this with angry people. They tend to be angry. What they've just discovered is something to be angry about. Now, part of what happens, and again, I think Tom Holland is very much his book Dominion is worth reading in this, and Jordan Peterson has been one of the sort of the instigations of this. Tom Holland has been very helpful in a lot of ways for me sort of piecing things together, as has Charles Taylor. Protestantism was part of a big adjustment, reform, Charles Taylor would talk about in The Secular Age. Geneva created something of a one-speed religion. In traditional society, you had your saints and your clergy and your holy people, and they were supposed to, as a collective, do work for the collective. There's a great line in one Martin Luther biography where, I don't remember, was it the Cistercian monks, who basically the Lord was going to bring the end of time and judgment day, but it was the prayers of the Cistercian monks that sort of held it at bay. This is one of the things that Luther believed. And so you had this idea of sort of two-speed religions. You had your spiritual athletes who were really doing service for the world with their monasteries and their prayers and all of the things that they were doing. And then it was the job of the spiritual people to pray and to do service, do the work of the church in that certain area to, manage the gods and everything else. And people down below, it was their job to feed the monks. It was the monks' job to pray, and it's regular people's job to feed the monks. It's sort of a two-speed religion. Well, part of what happens in the Protestant movement is that, John Calvin isn't happy with, let's say, just having holy clergy. He wants everyone in town to be holy. And this vision very much picks up in the Reformation and in the Reformed movement, so that when you have English reformers crossing the ocean, Puritans and pilgrims, they will in fact try to establish holy cities. And they will work really hard in getting everybody into church and everybody being a saint. Of course, one of these big changes is that pre-Protestant Reformation, we use the word saint as exceptional spiritual athletes who could do more, they could renounce more, they could pray more, they could think better, they could do all this stuff at a higher level. And then in the realm of the secular, that was where ordinary people were. And, you admonish those ordinary people to do the sacraments and do those things, but it was really the job of the spiritual elites to sort of show the way. Now, it's my experience that this has by no means departed, even from the Christian Reformed Church. You see this in practice. People continue to have higher expectations of clergy than they have for lay people. Yet the vision of a holy city, a one-speed religion, is very much still with us. One of my very early videos was with someone who was studying the history of New Haven, Connecticut, and was rather shocked to see that the founders of New Haven, Connecticut were looking for their city planning from the end of the book of Revelation and the new heavens. This is a common thing in the Reformational period. And even though partly what happens is this religious aspect, as we would call it, sort of disappears, the motivation of banishing racism, sexism, bigotry of any sort from the world, this has to go all the way down and leave no stone or church or fairly mindless person unturned. You need, in fact, to have a holy and a pure society to get rid of all of these things. Secularism is in many ways Christian eschatology. It's just kind of a Christianity altered in a few ways, in some ways to suit Enlightenment sensibilities. We really saw this during George Floyd. So the mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg, a really fine man. I don't know if he's an observant Jew, but there he is, along with the police chief. And well, why is everyone kneeling? Is there a cross or an altar in front of them that they're kneeling to? Why are they kneeling at all? And one of the things that many people noted during the George Floyd summer was all of these atheist people are doing all of these religious movements. And it doesn't matter the color of their skin or their religious heritage or anything like that. The liturgy seems to be set, and it seems to be, in some ways, a Christian liturgy. And of course, many Christians would say, yes, indeed, but you don't have to be Christian to have all of these things. This is just what it means to be a good person. Activism, in many ways, thanks to the civil rights movement, has become religion itself. It doesn't matter that many of these people that were marching in the South to end Jim Crow were trained and tested and prepared in church. What mattered was that they marched. And in fact, you can look at marches as far older Christian psychotechnologies when you look at processions and many of the things that, in fact, the Protestant Reformation itself did away with. Activism became spiritual warfare for an increasingly secularized world. It was quite marked that, we all had to do the right thing by staying inside during COVID, but once George Floyd was killed by the police officers, well, now suddenly it's okay to go out there and, congregate in mass audiences. You couldn't be in church, but you could go be an activist. And people noted this and said, no, wait a minute. The virus doesn't care why you're there. And suddenly all of the church people said, you see, your value system is showing. People have more concern for a son or a daughter marrying another political party today in America than marrying another race or another religion. And it sort of shows, well, this has become the new religion of the day. There's lots of people out there who are nuns, N-O-N-E-S, but we really care who they're going to vote for. This sort of reached new heights during the Jenner Pepsi commercial that poor Pepsi had to break down. You can still find it on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. One of my favorite tweets was by an African American who noted that moment where she flips off the blonde wig and tosses it to the African American assistant. And then the person clipped, "Hold my wig, Keisha. I've got some liberating to do." And the assistant says, "My name is Jennifer." But that's sort of the moment. Morality and the elites of our attention economy were right there in the Pepsi movement. You don't need Jim Crow. You don't need George Floyd. You don't need anything. This can serve the Eucharist of Pepsi. And it all works the same. It's all the movements are there. All the optics are there. And, well, you can sell sugary carbonated beverage by understanding the religion of the moment. And they did. Now, one of the real ironies that is cropping up is realized eschatology in the right side of history instead of hell avoidance. Over the last number of years, it's been interesting watching the concern of different elements of our thinking. So all of these synodical delegates have been sent to synod because they are office bearers in the Christian Reformed Church. In some ways, they are the leaders of the church. We would imagine that they have been catechized, that they have listened to hundreds and hundreds of Christian sermons. They have read Christian books. They know their Bible. They subscribe to the creeds and confessions of the Christian Reformed Church. But before they do, the most important thing they need to do, one would imagine, which is vote in synod, what they need is a hour-long lecture on use of power. Or in past synods, they need training in anti-racism. Or they need on and on and on and on. And it's sort of like Well, let's say you're an NBA player, and what you really need are lessons in how to tie your shoes. Now, because all through your life you've been tying your shoes wrong. And, well, I certainly think everybody should be cognizant of their use of power, and I certainly think that racism, we certainly don't want a lot of racist behavior at Synod. Two thoughts come to mind. Number one, are these patterns in our life really so available for exorcism that an half hour or an hour before Synod can exorcise them? You know, it's sort of like, oh, I guess I was a racist because I didn't know any better. And in an hour, you've showed me I'm a racist, and so I won't be one now. That doesn't even work within the anti-racism thinking. You can't just talk someone out of racism in a half hour. The civil rights movement would have been pointless if you could do something like that. Same goes with use of power. We hear all this talk about implicit bias. And when people say that, it's like, did you forget what the word implicit means? Part of the reason that we have church every week, part of the reason that we have catechisms, part of the reason that we have all of this is because ostensibly the church believes that these are the most important things in the world with respect to the church. All of this traditional formulation. But now suddenly, before we're to do the work of Synod, oh, by the way, you might have power and racism problems. Oh, here, let me take care of that for you. Oh, okay. Well, you know, if there's a spot on my shirt or if there's a problem with my collar, you can take care of that quickly. But if you listen to anybody who talks about power or racism or any of these things, well, they'll tell you that, well, actually dealing with these things are the work of one's whole life. Something analogous to, in many ways, total depravity and our struggle with sin and all of the ways that historically and traditionally we've said, well, you should go to church every week and you should do your daily devotions and all of this. I remember John McWhorter, who is an atheist by profession, noting that all of this new stuff was in some ways a new religion. And John McWhorter noting all of this and then going to one of the elite meetings that he was often invited into. If you don't know who John McWhorter is, go ahead and look him up. And he noted that that some of the people at these events were bragging about the fact that they had hired coaches who would coach them every week on their power and privilege and whiteness, implicit whiteness. And he, an African American, said, you know, what's going on here? You know, this is basically a secular priesthood. And this is something analogous to church. And yes, it is. Notice that what has been one thing is now in the religious register. And because of our attention economy, we all only have maybe 16 or 18 hours of conscious time each day, and much of that is filled with all sorts of other things. One thing is going to displace the other. And all of this religious attention seems to be, well, I guess when we talk about it, we'll say it's important, but it's certainly not as important as these other things that we have to mandate Synod do. So what this really does is sort of bear the question, what on earth do we mean by salvation? Is it more important that I be saved from hell or that I be saved from my racism? Now, again, as a minister, you can sort of put these together and say, well, racism is really part of the package of total depravity, and so you should definitely deal with your racism. And thanks be to God, the civil rights movement did what it did, and I think huge strides were made against racism in America. That doesn't mean that it's completely gone or that it will ever be completely gone. It will be endemic, again, analogous to what Calvinists say about our sin, which was one of the first dawnings on me back in the late aughts when I began to see some of this stuff really rise up. I thought, well, this is just Calvinism with focus on different sins, but also different remedies. And that's when I started talking about a confessional conversation, because it seemed to me these confessions are sort of moving away from each other. And the old confessions that we've had, they don't seem to be dealing with this stuff. And, well, there really isn't sort of a confession that deals with the stuff we're doing today, so we kind of have to reach into Heidelberg Question and Answer 108 to, well, now we can deal with the same-sex marriage thing. Question and Answer 108, the interpretation of it. And it's like, yeah, you have to go down a ways. Now, of course, there is the RCA, some people in that fight before the whole thing sort of split apart, they wanted to work on the Great Lakes Catechism on marriage and sexuality, which says, okay, well, we're going to have a new confession that deals directly with marriage and sexuality. And in some ways, that's the more direct approach. It really didn't work in the RCA. It's a fairly short catechism. It's a traditional catechism. And I wouldn't be surprised if, as years go by, a strategy like this isn't sort of looked at within the Christian Reformed Church and saying, well, maybe this needs to be a new catechism, because confessions sort of arise again out of contexts like the one that we've been seeing. So what is more salient to salvation? Human resources issues that, broadly speaking, in our culture, human resources departments are pushing on secular groups about power, privilege, and anti-racism. In fact, many institutions, I hear from people all the time where, well, you're just about to either start a new job or start a new school year or something like this. Well, you have to report, well, what are you doing against the implicit racism in your heart this year? And, if you don't list what you've done, well, you might lose your job. And a lot of secular people look at this and say, I grew up in church. They're like asking me, well, do you keep a daily quiet time? How many hours do you pray? Have you been reading your Bible? And again, this isn't anything to do against being anti-racist. We should be against racism. But you begin to say, well, what exactly is at the center? What exactly is salvation about? What are we looking to be saved from? And what is the realm of salvation? Is it a human future in the secular realm here below? Or is it an afterlife that, since the Enlightenment, many in society are both unconcerned about and, think that it's perhaps fictitious? Death is the big sleep. And people feel these tensions. They really do. Now, they often won't talk about them because it's like saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have quite as much worship as Synod. It's like saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be quite so anti-racist. When did you stop being a racist? It's like, it's really hard to speak out against these things because then people say, aha, you're really a racist. We see it there. Well, no, but what is at the center? And what contributes to the center? How does this thing really work? Who needs the church when you have political parties? And this, in fact, is what a great many people have simply decided. Church is sort of a niche, particular interest that maybe you like because you grew up in it, sort of like NASCAR or, raising dogs or cats. It's sort of a niche thing, but it's hardly important or essential. Now, I've done a lot more talking about how the Enlightenment leads into this, how, in a sense, if you again go back to the Tim Keller piece that I played in the previous video, he gets into some of those issues. Who needs the church when you have political parties? Isn't politics what will determine the salvation of marginalized people? Well, what exactly is their salvation anyway? Access to middle-class jobs and goods and services? Well, we certainly don't want obstacles based on racism with respect to these things. But then what, in fact, are the hierarchies that people are supposed to achieve? And these issues are ringing throughout our culture right now. The new Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action. And the church, has really ever since the Civil War and increasingly into the 20th century seemed to be sort of on the sidelines. And the civil rights movement and what happened in that movement really cemented that status. And so churches that wanted to get into the vanguard are like, me too, me too. But if a church sort of evolves to keep in step with a certain liberationist effort, people will applaud, but that doesn't mean they're coming to your church. That's a very different thing. Civil rights issues are more salient than confessional distinctives. A lot of people noted that when one church in, I don't even know where the church was, when they started to toy with kinism, boy, suddenly they were guilty of heresy and out they went. And then Synod the next year realized what the previous Synod did before and said, whoa, wait a minute. If all you have to do to get rid of a church and its clergy is declare them heretical, we've just created a new nuclear weapon. We've got to put that thing under control. And you can see in Synod 2022, that's in fact what they did. Well, things have to, if we're going to declare something a heresy, we can sort of bypass the church order and sweep them out of the denomination. And then, of course, in the context of this fight, people are saying, well, isn't Neeland Avenue practicing heresy? Can't we just sweep them out of the denomination? Ooh, we've got to put some buffers around that heresy word, and that's what Synod 2022 did. How important are the issues of central confessional attention when we act like other issues are of more importance? Those confessions that the Christian Reformed Church have, well, there's a lot of things in them. There are a lot of things in these confessions. Just read through the canons of Dort, and all the confessions are right there. Are they the most salient? Are they the most important? Are issues within history as important as issues outside of history, either after life or after the second coming, which are salient to us? These are all the issues we are wrestling with. Which church or no church? What really do we mean by salvation? Is it sexual fulfillment? Is it expressive individualism? Is it progressive liberationism? What exactly are we saved from, to, and for? Now I go back to Reverend Scott Vanderploeg's moment at Synod in the video that I made. Because when he stood up and said, this is the issue I most care about, everybody understood that he was saying the sexuality issue is not what's really important. And I actually agree with him. But that sort of re-asks the question, because, well, what on earth do we mean by salvation? What are we talking about? What is this worldview? Now, part of what happened in the modernist fundamentalist fight, and part of how neo-evangelicalism developed, was dealing with the question, well, saved from what? Well, saved from hell, saved from alienation from God. But again, for many people in the culture, well, God is sort of a made-up creature, so who cares about him? And I said creature intentionally there, because that's what they think God is. And so when you look at how Jordan Peterson and others have been sort of unseating New Atheism and why New Atheism is losing, well, you get into these questions of, well, exactly what is this strange universe that we're living in? Why is the CRC in trouble anyway? As I mentioned before, in many ways, CRC is like an obese, diabetic, COPD patient, and same-sex marriage comes along and it's our COVID. It might kill us, or it might actually force us to maybe go on a diet, change our habits, and relook at the world in some new ways. There's no real going back. Why did the RCA break up? Well, it sort of split them up. How are these issues connected? Just this morning, in fact, I got an email from movement.org, and it says this: Dear Paul, you are a valuable part of our mission of seeing every city flourish spiritually and socially. Oh? We would love to share invitations and announcements with you via email. Get in line. These may include Movement Day invitations, learning community and prayer call announcements, and general updates. Please click Confirm Subscription below if you would like to receive communication from us. Blessings. Movement.org. Don't you just see tons of this? This is just particularly stark. Activism itself is what we're up to. Now, we can add some religiously language on it. We can maybe talk about prayer, but, does this have any confessional connection? I don't see anything here about tulip or the sacraments or anything like that. No. It's just movement.org. We're just moving. Okay, but this is kind of what religion has become. Generic, plain. The only thing that remains, meaning it's the central thing, is movement, change, activism, seeing every city flourish spiritually and socially. And if, in fact, let's say, instead of an email coming to my inbox, a person had come to my door and or looking to recruit me for their movement.org, I would probably sit down and say, describe flourishing for me. Tell me what you mean by that word spiritual. What do you mean by that word social? Are there any principalities and powers involved in this? If you say no, what on earth do you do with the Apostle Paul? Atheism already is left with only activism. Well, that's sort of where a lot of this stuff goes. Now, this video is following the moderates' pause on progress. And yeah, that's sort of where I'm at. When I watched all of this happen, when it was like, do I really need Jesus if I just don't want to be a bigot? It seems if you ask most people in the culture, they'd say, you don't need Jesus to not be a bigot. How is Jesus connected with bigotry? I remember, maybe I'll pull it up. He posted it. I think it's fair. John Sook, of course, was editor of the Banner in the Christian Reformed Church. He was a missionary. John Sook was an elite guy. I did a conversation with John Sook a couple years ago, but I remember in 2014, I was reading John Sook's blog. He certainly isn't blogging as much as he used to, but Wednesday, January 1, 2014, sermon entitled Jesus, Racial Slur, and the Bible. He talks about how he used to preach about that and how, but the slur rankled somewhere deep inside. Now, years later, I have an African-American grandson, an Afghani foster daughter. I have an African daughter-in-law who stopped in at 2 a.m. in East Grand Rapids, not because she was speeding, but because she was out of place. And so Jesus and the Canaanite woman, was Jesus a racist? And it's watching people try to interpret this passage in many places is really quite interesting. And so, and I just watch all this stuff and I think, what's going on here? And I think many people, a lot of the deconverted, have basically come to the decision that, Jesus was a smart guy. Jesus was a nice guy. Jesus did a lot of things in history, but Jesus wasn't who the church said he was. And, when it comes to a whole bunch of new things, Jesus sees them clearer than we do. And so why should I go to a church that focuses on Jesus? Sorting all this stuff out is an issue, but it seems to be an expression of far larger issues. And it leaves people to ask very deep questions about, what exactly is salvation? What exactly is the church for? And so, again, it was this was January 2014. This was me writing in February 2014, long before my YouTube channel started. These are the issues that I was weighing over, that I was weighing on. What, in fact, are the issues? What is Christianity? What is salvation? This is why you need a confessional conversation and, maybe even for some a creedal conversation. If, in fact, you don't believe Jesus is Lord. And so a lot of what happens, of course, in churches that continue to be connected to Jesus and committed to Jesus is, well, now we have to sort of turn this around. So, Jesus isn't. We have to figure out why Jesus would talk to this Canaanite woman in such a way and make this quip about dogs. And for a lot of people, the easiest way was just throw out the whole thing. Okay. But then what are you left with? And where will you go? These are the issues that are beneath people walking away from the church. And these are the issues. Some people basically look at the church and say, it's all these sunk costs of Christianity that I want to be done with. And then they just sort of slip into implicit secularism and even atheism or agnosticism. And I think if the church doesn't actually deal with these issues, or in fact, if individuals don't deal with these issues, they're just going to, in many ways, sort of deconstruct. A few weeks ago, I had a wonderful conversation with Richard Beck, whose blog I was following. And part of the reason why I really wanted to talk to Richard Beck was he and I have sort of been on parallel trajectories in many ways. We both sort of were kind of deconstructing at the same time and then reconstructing in sort of this post-progressive frame that we have been. And he's continued to write about it. Just recently, he had a post on deconstruction. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush on this post, but there are many exceptions people will be willing to point out. But I do want to describe something that's long been going on under the label deconstruction amongst ex-evangelicals. To start, let me say that there's nothing wrong with deconstruction as a developmental process. As we mature spiritually, we all have to confront beliefs about God, faith, and the church that were immature, in error, or dysfunctional, or even sometimes just merely inherited. We have to make them our own. That's part of the reason for profession of faith in the Christian Reformed Church. As Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 15, when I was a child, yada, yada, yada. Also, deconstruction is not a new thing. St. John of the Cross called it a dark night of the soul, when immature, adulterous conceptions of God are burned away in a painful, disoriented process. My point here is that deconstruction is biblically, theologically, and spiritually legitimate, vital even. We shouldn't stigmatize deconstruction out of hand. Every mature Christian has been involved in some deconstruction at some point or another. Now, I'm going to put some nuance in this. I have a video about sophisticated Christians versus simple Christians, which I've got a lot of thoughts about that. Part of what he said here. Now, of course, to change your political party as an adult is going to involve some deconstruction of the beliefs and values you grew up with. You might, for example, need to deconstruct on how you once read the Bible literally as a child and teen if you became an adult, became convinced of evolution. The same as you'd need to deconstruct if you change your views on LGBTQ folks. I'm not denying there's difficulty and challenge journey to be made there if your values shift or you embrace scientific literacy. But at the same time, what's driving the deconstruction is more political than theological. That political dynamic is what I'm trying to name here. Given all the drama around deconstruction, aren't we mainly just watching former Republicans become Democrats? Because when I look at the ex-evangelical crowd, that's mostly what I see as the end game of the journey. A change of political parties. You were once a Jesus and John Wayne Christian, and now you're a woke social justice warrior Christian. Now, again, for me, this wasn't my path because I grew up in a racial reconciliation church. We all voted for the Democrats. I didn't have to stop voting Republican. I never started. But as I watched this thing develop, I began to think, things are changing here. And I'm not sure people are either aware or honest, probably not simply aware, that they're just rejiggering the language. But what's happening isn't what they think is happening. So we're sorting all of this out. And it's happening right now over the question of same-sex marriage at Synod. But it's very much an expressor of larger issues. And the issues go far beyond just politics of the moment. Bill Viss noted that my hand was shaking. Bill, I'm shaking it intentionally, just to let you know, so you're not worried about my health. It's easy to get swept up in the broader religious cultural moment, but what is really going on with respect to how we have construed religion, salvation, meaning, spirit, reality, that's really what I'm interested in. Because if you're going to be a preacher, those are actually the issues you have to address. In many respects, when people deconstruct, the preacher is usually the last to know. They've stopped attending church and out they are. And, I sure wish we would have had a conversation about that. Not necessarily that I could have changed your path. Maybe I could have, maybe I couldn't. But why could I or couldn't I have? Well, those are the questions I'm concerned about. So, yeah. Why are moderates pausing? Because a whole lot more is going on than just talking about same-sex marriage. So, leave a comment.